The air inside the old community hall was thick and heavy, smelling faintly of floor wax and the sharp scent of too many people crowded into a small space. It was a Saturday afternoon, the kind of late spring day that promised warmth outside but trapped the heat inside. The large fans hanging from the high ceiling were spinning lazily, doing more to move the noise around than to cool anyone down. Rows of metal folding chairs had been set up in neat lines, most of them occupied by parents, grandparents, and younger siblings who looked like they would rather be anywhere else in the world. This was the annual district piano recital. It was the kind of event that felt less like a celebration of music and more like an endurance test. For 3 hours, one student after another would walk up to the shiny black Steinway piano on the stage, play a piece that ranged from nervous and shaky to competent but boring, and then bow to a polite smattering of applause. It was a routine, ritual, and today the crowd was restless. In the back row, a young woman sat hunched slightly forward, her elbows resting on her knees. Her name was Maya. She looked small against the backdrop of the bustling room. She wore a dress that didn't quite fit right, a simple blue thing with a hem that was slightly frayed at the edge. It was the kind of dress you found in the back of a thrift store rack, forgotten and unwanted. While the other students were dressed in crisp white shirts, shiny black shoes, and dresses with ribbons and lace, Maya blended into the beige walls of the hall. She was invisible to her left. A mother was aggressively whispering to her husband about a grocery list that needed to be done after the recital. To her right, 2 teenagers were scrolling through their phones, the blue light of their screens illuminating their bored faces. No one looked at Maya. No one noticed the way her hands were shaking slightly, not from cold, but from a deep, vibrating nervousness that settled in her chest like a heavy stone. Maya watched the stage intently, though. Her eyes didn't wander to the exit signs or the clock on the wall. She watched the boy who was currently playing. He was good, technically. His fingers hit the right notes, and his timing was perfect. He was playing a popular classical piece that everyone knew, a sonatina by Clementi. He finished with a dramatic flourish, lifted his hands high in the air to show he was done, and bowed deeply. "Thank you, Michael," the MC said into the microphone, his voice crackling slightly through the old speakers. "Next up, we have Maya." The name was spoken with a flat tone, just another checkmark on a long list. There was a pause as the MC looked around, confused for a moment as to where the next student was. Maya took a deep breath. She stood up. Her knees felt a little weak, but she forced them to hold her weight. As she walked down the center aisle toward the stage, she could feel the eyes of the room on her, but they weren't looks of anticipation. They were looks of people waiting for their turn to leave, or people glancing up to see who was making the floorboards creak, or people just staring blankly into the middle distance. She wasn't one of the star students. She didn't have the expensive private tutor that the other kids bragged about in the lobby. She had taught herself on a battered, second-hand upright piano that her father had bought from a neighbor moving out of state. It sat in the corner of their small living room, often competing for attention with the noise of the television or the shouting of neighbors through thin apartment walls. She practiced late at night, pressing a towel against the back of the piano to dampen the sound, so she wouldn't wake her younger brothers and sisters. Walking up the 3 steps to the stage felt like climbing a mountain. The spotlight hit her face, bright and blinding, hiding the audience from view, but making her feel even more exposed. She could feel the dust motes dancing in the light around her. She walked to the center of the stage, where the giant piano waited for her. It was a beautiful instrument, nothing like the one she had at home. It was polished to a shine, reflecting the hall like a black mirror. It looked imposing, regal, and intimidating. It felt like a beast that was waiting to see if she was worthy of touching it. Behind her, she could hear the shuffling of feet. A group of people near the back door were standing up, zipping up their jackets. They assumed the recital was entering the boring part, the part where the beginners played, or the students who didn't really matter played. They were leaving early to beat the traffic or get to dinner. Maya reached the bench. She didn't sit down immediately. She stood for a moment, adjusting her dress, trying to look professional even though she felt like a fraud. She could hear the low hum of conversations starting up again in the audience. The boy who had played before, Michael, was walking past her on his way off the stage. He didn't look at her. He was too busy basking in the praise his mother was whispering loudly to her neighbor. "Did you see his trills?" "So crisp," the mother said, loud enough for Maya to hear. "He really has a gift. It's amazing what dedication does." Maya gripped the edges of her sheet music. The pages were worn and dog-eared, the notes penciled in with a cheap graphite pencil that was smudging under her sweaty thumb. It was a difficult piece. It was a piece that most students at her level wouldn't dare touch. It wasn't a showy party piece. It was deep, emotional, and complex. It required a touch that was gentle, yet powerful. She sat down on the bench. It was harder than she expected, unforgiving. She adjusted the distance, scooting forward a bit, then back. She was taking her time. She knew she was taking her time. In the silence of the hall, between the murmur of the crowd and the first note, the seconds stretched out like hours. The MC, standing off to the side, checked his watch and sighed. A small sound that was picked up by the microphone and sent a spike of feedback through the speakers. The audience winced. "Sorry about that," the MC mumbled. The annoyance in the room was palpable. It was a collective feeling of, "Come on, get on with it." They were tired. They were hungry. They didn't care about the girl in the faded blue dress. They wanted the intermission so they could buy cookies and coffee and talk about their own children. Maya looked down at the keys. They were black and white, ivory and ebony, clean and perfect. She thought about her piano at home, where the C key stuck sometimes and had to be pulled up with a fingernail. She thought about her father working double shifts at the warehouse just to keep the lights on. She thought about the nights she spent hunched over the kitchen table, doing homework, listening to the rain. Dreaming of a moment where she could speak without words, she placed her left hand on the keys, then her right. Her fingers were short, her nails cut short to the quick. The room continued to buzz. The people by the door had opened the door now, letting in a blast of fresh air and the sound of distant traffic. They were halfway out. Maya took a breath, filling her lungs with the stale air of the hall. She closed her eyes for just a second to find her center, to find the quiet place inside her where the music lived. When she opened them again, the look in her eyes had changed. The nervousness was still there, buried deep, but it was covered now by a mask of intense focus. She wasn't the invisible girl in the corner anymore. She was the master of the instrument in front of her. She hovered her hands over the keys, feeling the magnetic pull of the strings vibrating inside the wooden body of the piano. The audience saw nothing but a poor girl about to play a simple song. They saw a pause, a hesitation, a lack of confidence, but the piano was waiting. The music was waiting. And Maya was about to show them that they shouldn't have judged the book by its cover. She flexed her fingers, ready to unleash the sound she had been holding inside for so long. The chatter in the room was at its peak, a dull roar of indifference. Maya leaned forward. She was ready. The silence that followed wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the kind of awkward, heavy quiet that happens when a room full of people realizes something is taking longer than expected. It was the silence of impatience. The hum of the air conditioners seemed to get louder, filling the gap where the music should have already started, down in the front row. A man in a gray suit checked his watch for the third time in as many minutes. He tapped the face of the watch and let out a sharp sigh, exhaling loudly through his nose. He wasn't trying to be mean, but he was bored. Everyone was bored. They had heard 20 students play today. They had heard enough mistakes and enough stumbling piano scales to last them a lifetime. They just wanted the next student to play their 3 minutes of music so they could all stand up, stretch their legs, and go get a cup of lukewarm coffee in the lobby. To the people watching, Maya looked frozen. She was just sitting there, staring at the keys. Her back was straight, her shoulders were tense, and her hands hovered just an inch above the ivory. "Is she okay?" A whispered voice floated up from the second row. "I think she forgot the notes." Another voice hissed back, followed by a quiet, muffled giggle. It was a cruel assumption, but an easy one to make. When you look at someone who doesn't seem to fit in, it is easy to assume they don't belong. They saw her simple dress, her worn-out shoes that peeked out from under the hem of her skirt, and the way she gripped the sides of the bench. They saw a poor girl who was probably terrified and regretting signing up for the recital. They prepared themselves for a disaster. They prepared for her to burst into tears or to play a few wrong notes and stop. The audience was ready to be sympathetic, but in a condescending way. They were ready to say, "Oh, it's okay, sweetie. You tried?" But that wasn't what was happening inside Maya's head. Inside her mind, there was no community hall, no smell of wax, and no impatient audience. She was standing at the edge of a vast, deep ocean in her imagination. She was visualizing the opening of the song. It wasn't just a list of notes to her. It was a story she needed to tell. The piece she had chosen was intense. It demanded respect. She knew that if she rushed into it, if she played the first note before she was absolutely ready, the whole thing would fall apart. It would be just noise. So she waited. She listened to her own breathing. And out. The MC stood off to the side of the stage, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He looked at his clipboard, wondering if he should say something to wake her up, or if he should just let her figure it out. The lights overhead cast a bright glare on the piano, making the dust particles dance like tiny stars. The atmosphere was getting uncomfortable. People started to shuffle their feet. The sound of candy wrappers crinkling in programs being rattled echoed through the room. The man who was leaving by the door paused, one foot out in the hallway. He looked back at the stage, annoyed that the recital had stalled. He couldn't see Maya's face. He just saw the back of a stationary figure. "Come on," he muttered under his breath. "We haven't got all day." He wasn't the only one feeling it. The collective mood of the room was shifting from boredom to agitation. It was the feeling of a bus stopping at a red light that won't turn green. Everyone just wanted to move, but then something subtle changed. It was so small that only a few people noticed it at first. Maya lifted her chin. She stopped looking down at her hands and lifted her head to look straight ahead at the back wall of the hall. Her eyes lost that look of fear and glazed over with a look of intense concentration. It was the look of a runner right before the gun goes off, or a boxer right before the bell rings. She slowly lowered her hands. Her left hand moved to the lower end of the keyboard, pressing down deep into the bass keys. Her right hand floated higher up. She wasn't in a hurry. Her movements were slow, deliberate, and heavy with purpose. She was coiling a spring, gathering energy. The audience didn't know what was coming. They were used to students rushing. They were used to kids playing as fast as they could just to get it over with. But Maya wasn't rushing. She was pulling the energy out of the room. The air around the piano seemed to still. The people in the front row stopped checking their phones for a split second, sensing that something about the way she sat there was different. It was a heaviness, a gravity. The whispers died down a little. Not because they were interested, but because they were confused. Why wasn't she playing? Then Maya took a deep, shuddering breath that filled her lungs to the very bottom. She squared her shoulders. In that moment, she wasn't a poor girl from the apartments anymore. She was a musician, and she was about to attack the piano with everything she had. She knew that once she started, there was no going back. Once she hit that first chord, she had to commit to the storm she was about to unleash. The silence stretched on for one more agonizing second. It was the calm before the storm, the quiet before the scream. The pianist on the bench and the piano in front of her became one thing. A machine ready to make a sound that would rattle the windows. The man by the door rolled his eyes and turned to leave completely. The mother in the third row leaned over to whisper something to her friend. The MC opened his mouth to tap the microphone, and then Maya dropped her hands. The impact was instantaneous. It wasn't a soft beginning. It wasn't a gentle trickle of water. It was a crash. A boom. A massive, roaring wall of sound that exploded from the instrument and slammed into the audience like a physical wave. The chatter was cut off instantly, like a knife slicing through bread. The people who were turning to leave froze in their tracks. The man checking his watch dropped his wrist in shock. The silence was over, and nobody was bored anymore. The sound that exploded from the piano didn't just hit the ears of the audience, it hit them in the chest. It was a massive, opening chord that seemed to shake the dust from the ceiling rafters and rattle the loose change in people's pockets. For a split second, everyone in the room forgot to breathe. The hum of the air conditioners, the rustle of papers, and the murmurs of conversation were all instantly wiped out, completely drowned by the sheer volume and power of the music. The man who had been sighing and checking his watch in the third row jumped in his seat, his eyes snapping wide open. He looked up, startled, as if a thunderclap had just gone off indoors. The woman who had been whispering about her grocery list clamped her mouth shut, her hand freezing halfway to her bag of candies. Even the people who had been standing up, ready to leave through the back doors, stopped dead in their tracks. They turned around slowly, drawn by a sound that commanded authority. This wasn't the clumsy, hesitant plinking they had expected. It wasn't the simple nursery rhyme tunes that the previous students had played. This was a sound of raw, unfiltered power. It was heavy, dark, and intense. Maya didn't look like a shy girl anymore. Her hands, which had looked so small and fragile a moment ago, were now striking the keys with a force that seemed impossible for her thin arms. She wasn't tapping the notes. She was attacking them. She was digging into the ivory, her fingers moving fast and hard, driving the rhythm deep into the wood of the instrument. The piano, which had looked like a piece of furniture to the audience, suddenly came alive. It was growling. It was roaring. The opening of the piece was chaotic and fast. It was a storm of notes that cascaded down the keyboard like a waterfall of rocks. The audience sat in stunned silence. They were witnessing a complete transformation. Just seconds ago, they had pitied her. They had looked at her faded dress and her cheap shoes and assumed she was a nobody. Now, she was the only person in the world who mattered. The mother in the front row, who had been smugly discussing her own son's talent, felt her jaw drop. She watched Maya's hands fly across the keys. It was a blur of motion, so fast that the eye could barely follow it. There was no hesitation in Maya's playing, no fear. Every note was sharp and clear. She hit the wrong notes. No, she didn't miss a single one. She played with a precision that was terrifying. It was the kind of playing that takes thousands of hours of lonely, grinding practice to achieve. The room was electric. The air seemed to vibrate with the energy coming from the stage. People who had been bored were now leaning forward in their seats, their necks craning to get a better look. They couldn't believe what they were hearing. They were trying to match the sound to the person playing it, but it didn't make sense. How could this quiet, overlooked girl produce such a massive sound? The music shifted suddenly. The heavy, crashing chords gave way to a fast, intricate run that danced up the high end of the keyboard. Maya's right hand skittered across the keys like a spider, playing light, trilling notes that sparkled like diamonds, while her left hand kept a heavy pounding beat underneath. It was a contrast of light and dark, of soft and hard. It was complex and dangerous. A young boy in the second row, who had been kicking the leg of the chair in front of him out of boredom, stopped his feet. He stared at Maya with wide eyes, completely mesmerized. He didn't understand the music theory, and he didn't know the name of the piece, but he knew power when he saw it. He looked at Maya's face. Her expression was intense. Her eyes were locked on her hands, her brows furrowed in deep concentration. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't performing for them. She was battling the piano, and she was winning. The sound was so full that it filled every corner of the hall. It bounced off the walls and the floor, wrapping around the audience. It was a physical sensation. You could feel the bass notes in your stomach. The people in the very back row, who usually couldn't hear anything over the whispering, were now hearing every single note perfectly. The MC, who had been looking at his clipboard, dropped it. He didn't even care. He just stared at the stage, his mouth slightly open. He had organized hundreds of these recitals. He had heard hundreds of students play. He had never heard anything like this. He looked at the girl in the blue dress and realized he had made a terrible mistake. He had dismissed her. He had categorized her as just another beginner. He realized now that he was standing in the presence of a master. The silence in the room had changed. Before, it was a silence of boredom and indifference. Now it was a silence of awe. It was the kind of silence you find in a cathedral or a library. No one wanted to break it. No one wanted to cough or sneeze or shift in their chair. They were afraid that if they made a sound, the magic would be broken. They were trapped in the music, held there by the strength of Maya's will. The music swelled again, rising to a crescendo that was louder and more intense than the opening. Maya's body was swaying now, moving with the rhythm. She was lost in the music. She wasn't thinking about the audience anymore. She wasn't thinking about her dress or her shoes or what people thought of her. She was pouring everything she had into the piano. All the years of being ignored. All the nights of practice while the world slept. All the hunger and the hard work, it was all coming out through her fingertips. The audience didn't just hear it. They felt it. It was a humbling experience. They realized that they had judged a book by its cover, and they had been wrong. They looked at Maya and saw a strength that they had missed. The girl who was invisible was now undeniable. As the first major section of the piece came to an end, Maya lifted her hands off the keys for a fraction of a second, a pause that felt as dangerous as the music itself, and then plunged them back down for the next movement. The shock of the first notes was gone, replaced by a new feeling. The audience wasn't just watching anymore. They were listening, really listening, and they were scared to miss a single note. The music shifted again, leaving behind the thunder and lightning of the opening and dipping into something entirely different. It was a melody that was soft, fragile, and heartbreaking. Maya's hands, which had been striking the keys like hammers just moments before, were now barely touching them. She was coaxing sounds out of the piano that sounded like a human voice. Crying in the distance, the change in the room was instant. The adrenaline that had everyone on the edge of their seats now settled into a deep, heavy focus. It was so quiet now that you could hear the building settling. The wooden beams creaking in the heat, but no one dared to make a sound. The audience was holding its collective breath, afraid that even a cough might shatter the beauty of what was happening on stage. This wasn't just technical skill anymore. The people watching realized that speed and power weren't the only weapons this girl had. She had control. She had a touch that was so gentle it felt like she was trying not to wake a sleeping baby. Her right hand played a high, lonely line of notes that hung in the air like spider silk, while her left hand provided a deep, steady pulse that felt like a heartbeat. The woman who had been whispering about grocery list earlier was now perfectly still. Her shopping list lay crumpled in her lap, forgotten. She wasn't thinking about dinner anymore. She was thinking about her own life, about memories that this music seemed to pull out of her. That was the magic of what Maya was doing. She wasn't just playing notes on a page. She was playing emotions. She was taking the feelings she had locked away, the loneliness, the hard work, the quiet hope, and translating them into sound. The man who had been ready to leave by the door had let the door close softly. He was standing in the back shadows, his jacket still halfway on, but he couldn't move. He was rooted to the spot. He watched Maya's face. It was peaceful now, her eyes half closed, a small, sad smile touching her lips. It was the face of someone who had found a home in the music. He realized he had never seen anyone look so free before. It is a strange thing, watching a stranger open their soul in a public place. The audience felt like they were intruding, yet they couldn't look away. They were seeing the real Maya, not the girl in the cheap dress, not the quiet student in the back of the class. They were seeing the person who had spent hours alone in a room. Turning her struggles into something beautiful, the melody grew more complex. Maya's fingers began to dance again, weaving the soft high notes with a rich, warm harmony in the middle of the keyboard. It was a conversation between two voices, sometimes agreeing, sometimes arguing, but always moving together. The sound was so full and round that it seemed to fill the empty spaces in the hall. It washed over the people in the metal chairs, soothing their impatience, calming their busy minds. The pianist's posture had changed completely. The shy, hunched-over girl was gone. She sat tall, her shoulders back, owning the space around her. The piano was no longer a beast she was fighting. It was an extension of her body. Her fingers knew exactly where to go without looking. She seemed to be in a trance, a state of flow, where thinking stops and feeling takes over in the front row. The mother who had been so proud of her own son looked at him, then back at Maya. Her son had played perfectly. He had hit every note correctly with precision and care. But listening to Maya, she realized there was a difference between playing the notes and playing the music. Her son played like he was painting by numbers. Maya played like she was painting a masterpiece from her heart. It was a humbling realization. She reached out and gently took her son's hand, squeezing it. He didn't pull away. He was just as mesmerized as she was. The music swelled slowly, building up layer by layer. Maya added more notes, the sound getting thicker and warmer. It felt like a tide coming in. She was drawing them in deeper and deeper. The audience was no longer a room full of separate people. They were a single unit, connected by the sound waves coming from the stage. Their petty annoyances, their judgments about clothes and status, their hunger and their fatigue all evaporated. There was only the music. It is rare to see a room full of people completely captivated. Usually there is always someone distracted. But today, for these few minutes, everyone was present. A teenage girl in the 5th row had tears streaming down her face, wiping them away aggressively with her sleeve, not caring about her makeup. An old man in the back had removed his hat and held it against his chest, his head bowed in respect. They all felt it. They all understood that they were witnessing something special. Maya's hands moved faster now, the complexity increasing, but the softness remained. It was a delicate balance. One wrong note, one heavy hand, and the spell would be broken. But she didn't miss. She played with a confidence that was terrifying. She took risks, skipping across the keyboard with lightning speed, landing perfectly every time. It was fearless. The sunlight that had been streaming through the high windows began to fade as the afternoon wore on, casting a golden glow over the stage. The dust motes dancing in the light looked like gold dust swirling around Maya. In that light, with the music soaring around her, she didn't look like a poor girl from a difficult background. She looked like a queen. She looked glorious. She played a run of notes that cascaded down the scale like water tumbling over rocks in a river. It was fluid and natural. As she played, she swayed her body, feeling the rhythm in her spine. She wasn't performing for the crowd. She was dancing with the piano. It was intimate and private, yet it was happening in front of 100 people. The MC stood in the wings, his arms crossed over his chest, watching the monitors. He had seen hundreds of recitals. He knew the difference between a student playing a song and a musician telling a story. He knew that this was a moment that everyone in that room would remember for the rest of their lives. They would forget about the heat. They would forget about the uncomfortable chairs. But they would never forget the girl who stopped the room. The music began its final climb toward the climax. Maya leaned into the piano, her body pressing forward as if she was trying to get closer to the strings inside. The sound grew louder, richer, and more urgent. The heartbeat of the bass got faster. The high notes cried out. The tension in the room was almost unbearable. Everyone knew the end was coming, but they didn't want it to. They wanted to stay in this world she had created. A world where beauty and truth mattered more than money or status. Maya poured everything she had left into the instrument. The sweat was shining on her forehead now. Her dress clung to her back. She was giving every ounce of her energy to this moment. It was a gift. She was giving the audience the best part of herself, asking for nothing in return. And they were accepting it, with open hearts and open minds, finally seeing her for who she really was. The music reached a point where it seemed impossible to go any higher. Maya was playing with a furious intensity, her hands moving so fast they were almost a blur, filling the hall with a chaotic, beautiful storm of sound. Then, she played the final chord. It wasn't just a single note. It was a massive, resonant crash that seemed to lift the roof off the building. But she didn't stop there. She didn't pull her hands away immediately to soak up the applause. She did something that showed her true mastery. She slammed her foot down on the sustain pedal, holding the chord, letting the sound ring out into the silence. She kept her hands pressed firmly on the keys, feeling the wood vibrate beneath her palms. The sound hung in the air, loud and powerful at first, then slowly decaying, echoing off the walls, fading like a sunset. For 5 long seconds, nobody moved. The audience was frozen. The silence was heavier now than it had been before she started. It was a sacred silence. People were afraid to breathe, afraid to break the spell that the final note had cast over them. They were staring at the stage, their eyes wide, their hearts pounding in sync with the fading vibrations of the piano. It was as if time had stopped inside the community center, and for a moment there was no world outside those walls. There was only the sound and the girl who made it. Then, slowly, Maya lifted her hands. The silence was absolute. She lowered them to her lap and sat up straight. As the music faded away, the transformation began to reverse. The fierce expression on her face softened. The confident, commanding posture melted away. Slowly, shyly, she turned back into the girl they had ignored before. She looked small again, and a little bit afraid. She stood up from the bench. She looked out at the crowd, not with arrogance, but with a nervous hesitation, as if she suddenly realized where she was and what she had just done. She smoothed down the front of her faded dress and offered a small, awkward curtsy. It wasn't a polished bow like the other students had done. It was genuine and humble. That was the spark the room needed. The spell broke, not with a whimper, but with an explosion. The audience didn't just clap. They erupted. It was a wall of noise that was even louder than the music had been. People surged to their feet as one single organism. The stomping of feet on the wooden floor was deafening. A man in the front row, the same one who had been checking his watch earlier, was whistling loudly through his fingers, a huge grin stretching across his face. The mother who had been whispering about the grocery list was wiping tears from her eyes with a crumpled tissue. Clapping her hands raw, Maya looked up stunned. She had expected a polite round of applause, maybe a few bored hand claps. She wasn't prepared for this. She saw the hundreds of people standing, cheering for her. She saw their faces that were usually indifferent or tired now, lit up with excitement and joy. For the first time, she wasn't invisible. She was the center of the universe. The MC rushed onto the stage, his face red and flustered. He had never seen a reaction like this. He grabbed the microphone, his voice cracking slightly as he tried to talk over the noise. "Ladies and gentlemen, yes, absolutely incredible. Maya, everyone, give her another hand." But the crowd didn't need to be told. They were already screaming bravo and encore. The sound washed over Maya like a warm wave. She felt a heat rise in her cheeks, but this time it wasn't from embarrassment. It was from pride. She stood there for a long moment, looking out at the sea of people. She realized that she had done it. She had shown them who she was. She had bridged the gap between her world and theirs, if only for a few minutes. She didn't play an encore. She didn't have any other music prepared, and she knew that this moment couldn't be topped anyway. She bowed one last time, deeply and sincerely, and then turned to walk off the stage. As she walked toward the side wings, the applause followed her. It didn't stop when she left the piano. It grew louder as a sign of respect. Backstage, in the dim, dusty light of the curtains, she leaned against the wall and let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for her entire life. Her hands were trembling, but now it was from the rush of adrenaline, not fear. A few minutes later, the hallway outside the auditorium was packed. The intermission had finally arrived, but nobody was leaving to get coffee. They were crowding around the backstage door, waiting. Parents wanted to meet her. Students wanted to ask her how she played so fast. The man who had been sighing at his watch pushed his way to the front. He didn't have a child in the recital. He was just a music lover who had stumbled in out of the heat. He grabbed Maya's hand as she walked out, shaking it vigorously. "I've been coming to these recitals for 20 years, he said, his voice serious and intense. "I have never heard anything like that. You have a gift, young lady. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise." Maya didn't know what to say. She just nodded, a small smile touching her lips. Other people crowded around, showering her with compliments. They asked her who her teacher was. They asked her how long she had been practicing. They looked at her with new eyes. They didn't see the faded dress or the worn shoes anymore. They saw the talent. They saw the artist. The other students, the ones with the fancy clothes and the expensive tutors, stood off to the side. They watched her with a mix of awe and jealousy. For years, they had been the stars of the show. Today they realized that money couldn't buy what Maya had. They had learned a hard lesson. True beauty doesn't come from how you look on the outside. It comes from what you have inside and the courage to let it out. Eventually, the crowd began to thin out as people had to leave. The energy in the building remained changed. The atmosphere was no longer bored or stiff. It was buzzing with life. Maya's father, who had been working in the kitchen out back, finally came out to find her. He was a man who worked with his hands, tired and worn down by life. He saw the crowd around his daughter and stopped in his tracks. He didn't need to ask what happened. He could see it in her face. She was glowing. He walked up to her, ignoring the fancy people still standing around, and wrapped her in a big bear hug. He smelled of soap and hard work. "I told you you were good," he whispered in her ear, his voice thick with emotion. "I told you." Maya buried her face in his shoulder. She felt safe. She felt proud. The piano recital in the dusty community center was just a small event in a small town. And tomorrow, she would go back to her normal life. She would go back to her old piano and her hand-me-down clothes, but nothing would ever really be the same. She knew now that she had the power to stop her room. She knew that her voice mattered. As she walked out of the building with her father, the late afternoon sun was setting, casting long golden shadows across the parking lot. The air was cooling down. She walked a little taller, her head held high. She was still the girl from the wrong side of the tracks, but she wasn't invisible anymore. She was the girl who made the music that stopped the world, if only for a few minutes, and that was enough.